The Clone Wars were the first full-scale war to beset the Republic for nearly 1,000 years, and they forced the Republic to develop all manner of new military technologies, from capital ships to starfighters. In the previous centuries, the development of military technology had stagnated due to a prolonged period of peace, but as the new war began, the Republic's engineers scrambled to take advantage of recent technological advancements to bring Republic military tech into the modern age. This was especially true for starfighters. Right up until the start of the Clone Wars, the Republic and most of its local forces were still using older model starfighters, some of which dated back to the Sith Wars, but these designs had become hopelessly obsolete, and the Republic replaced them with a series of newer starfighter designs over the course of the war. In this video, we'll be taking a look at all of these starfighter designs, chronicling the development of Republic starfighter technology over the course of the Clone Wars.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Unlike some other factions, which considered their fighter wings to be part of their navies, the Republic gave its fighter pilots their own branch of the military, the Republic Starfighter Corps. Much like the Republic Navy, which it frequently worked alongside, the Republic Starfighter Corps had a long and proud history, having been established in around 15,000 BBY to defend outlying Republic colonies against Hutt-backed raiders. The Starfighter Corps was mostly deployed to defend planets, as early in Republic history, starfighters had limited utility in long-range deep space combat. As starfighter technology advanced, however, the fleets of the Republic Navy increasingly relied on fighter screens for protection and attack wings for force projection. By the time of the Clone Wars, starfighters had become a vital part of naval warfare, and the Republic Starfighter Corps went from being a largely independent operation that primarily operated planetary defense squadrons to being more or less an extension of the Republic Navy. It retained its status as an independent branch, mostly for historical reasons, but once the Republic became the Empire, the Starfighter Corps was rolled into the Imperial Navy. The Republic Starfighter Corps that fought in the Clone Wars was almost entirely composed of clone pilots who answered to members of the Jedi Starfighter Corps. As we've discussed in the past, the clones of the Starfighter Corps had it worse than those in any other part of Republic military, as they were constantly outnumbered by droid fighters capable of matching or even exceeding their performances in combat. The Confederacy had a consistent advantage when it came to starfighter combat all throughout the war, and the Republic scrambled to eliminate this advantage by developing better starfighters for its pilots. Over the course of the war, Loyalist contractors developed numerous fighter models for the Republic, and the Republic was constantly swapping between them to see which combinations gave them the smallest disadvantage. The Republic's many starfighter models were designed and manufactured by a diverse collection of corporations. Several were churned out by the Republic Navy's primary supplier, Kuat Drive Yards, as well as its subsidiary, Kuat Systems Engineering. The Core Worlds-based Incom Corporation and the Inner Rim-based Subpro Corporation collaborated on several Republic starfighter designs before dissolving their partnership during or just before the war. Other starfighters were contributed by the Grand Company Conseil Manufacturing and the Verpine conglomerate Slane and Corpil. Most of these different starfighter models followed the Starfighter Corps' standard battle doctrine, which favored long-range, sometimes hyperspace-capable snub fighters capable of attacking enemy capital ships, but some were space superiority fighters, designed primarily to intercept enemy fighters, which the Republic hadn't used much in prior wars. When the Republic adopted the Kaminoans' clone army at the start of the Clone Wars, the army came pre-equipped with all manner of vehicles the Kaminoans had specially designed for the clones' use, from walkers to capital ships. But in a surprising oversight, the Kaminoans didn't actually commission any starfighter designs from the companies it contracted to supply the Grand Army, which meant that, for the first few months of the Clone Wars, the Republic Starfighter Corps was scrambling to find starfighters for its pilots to use. In the early days of the war, It relied on a mismatched mix of prototypes, obscure and unusual designs that were soon discontinued, and relics used by the fighter wings of the judicial forces and planetary security forces. We have limited information about most of these, so we're going to discuss them all fairly briefly in this first section. Most planetary security forces at this time relied on two old but reliable starfighter models: the Z-95 Headhunter, which we'll talk about more in depth later, and the Aurek-class tactical strike fighter, which we talked about during our Old Republic ship overview. The Aurek was a positively ancient design by the time of the Clone Wars, having been originally designed for the Mandalorian Wars 4,000 years before. The Republic had stopped using it after the New Sith Wars, but the Aurek remained in use among the PSFs, which retrofitted the ancient design with modern technology and kept up production in private shipyards. By the Clone Wars, no amount of retrofitting could fix the fact that the Aurek was hopelessly obsolete, so the Republic Starfighter Corps didn't make use of them during the war, though a few did see service as part of Loyalist PSFs. Loyalist PSFs also made use of nimble T-19 starfighters, though there's no record of the RSC doing the same. The RSC did make a limited use of one of the Judicial Force's favoured space superiority fighter models, the A6 Interceptor. Designed by Kuat Drive Yards, the A6 was a small, short-range interceptor designed to protect Judicial capital ships against enemy snub fighters. A6 interceptors were very compact and rather brittle, operated by a single pilot and armed with a small bank of 3 light laser cannons. These fighters were several decades old by the time of the Clone Wars and obsolete in comparison to the Confederacy's starfighters, but they did see some small use in the conflict, likely in its early stages, and the starfighter hangars of the Victory and Venator-class star destroyers were designed with the A6 in mind. Ultimately though, these relics were insufficient for the RSC's purposes, and the Republic would have to design its own ships to flesh out its air wing width. Its first attempt was a crime against good design: the mercifully short-lived gunship fighters. These ships were based on the design of one of the two starfighter-adjacent craft the Kaminoans had commissioned, the LAAT gunship. The LAAT was not designed as a starfighter. In fact, it wasn't even designed for space operations. The original model was meant to deploy ground troops from assault ships in a planet's upper atmosphere and then provide those troops with air support. Modified versions capable of operating in space were quickly developed, but even then, they still lacked the maneuverability of true starfighters. Nonetheless, the LAAT was highly effective in its air support role, and in the First Battle of Geonosis, it dealt with Geonosian starfighters fairly effectively, so the Republic decided to convert a few LAATs into dedicated starfighters. These modified LAATs fell into two categories: gunship fighters and gunship bombers. Gunship fighters were smaller than the standard LAAT, with a single pilot, no troop carrying capacity, and heavier laser cannons. They came in two variants: the standard gunship fighter and the gunship fighter advanced, the latter of which was more heavily armed and armored and only bore a passing resemblance to the original LAAT. The gunship bombers, meanwhile, were bulky craft that replaced the LAAT's troop bay with storage and launchers for proton bombs. Enhanced and advanced variants of the standard gunship bomber also saw use, each with superior armor and weapons. All 5 of these different gunship variants saw use mostly in the first month of the Clone Wars, following which they were quickly discontinued, though one gunship bomber enhanced did see use in the later Battle of Argonar. The Republic Starfighter Corps made heavier use of 3 other obscure starfighter models in the early stages of the Clone Wars: the Cord-class starfighter, the Crusher-class starfighter, and the H-60 Tempest bomber. The Crusher-class starfighter was a heavily armored 2-man starfighter that we know very little about, while the Cord-class starfighter was a lightly armored interceptor that saw some use in the first months of the war. The Cord was equipped with a single laser cannon and operated by a single clone pilot, and some acclimated class assault ships were modified to carry squadrons of them during the early stages of the war. The H-60 Tempest bomber, meanwhile, was a somewhat infamous Slain and Corporal product which the Verpine had designed for the Republic in the decades leading up to the Clone Wars. This oddly designed, flying wing-type craft required 2 pilots, each seated in their own cockpits at opposite ends of the craft, and it functioned as a heavy bomber. With a maximum atmospheric speed of 950 km per hour, it was a rather sluggish craft, and it wasn't hyperspace capable despite its size. It was heavily armed, boasting 2 medium laser cannons, 2 light ion cannons, proton torpedo launcher, and a ventral proton bomb bay, and all told, it was fairly effective despite its bizarre design. However, the H-60 was inflexible, required extensive maintenance, and was resource intensive, which meant that it was strongly disliked by Republic planners. Only a few squadrons were ever produced, and the Republic Starfighter Corps made very limited use of them. Most were quickly relegated to scrapyards and replaced with other craft. It would only be after the Clone Wars that the H-60 Tempest earned its place in the history books, as Slain and Corporal would go on to use its design as the template for the venerable Rebel Alliance B-Wing Starfighter. With all these starfighters available to it, the Republic Starfighter Corps was able to make do for the first 2 months of the Clone Wars, but it was apparent from very early on that these craft were insufficient and unable to compete with the Confederacy's agile, state-of-the-art droid fighters. Only one class of Republic Starfighter in use at the start of the war could hold its own against the swarms of Vulture droids deployed by the enemy, the Jedi Order's custom-designed Interceptors. Designed by the renowned engineer Wallace Blissex for Kuat Systems Engineering, the Delta 7 Aethersprite-class light interceptor entered service shortly before the Clone Wars, commissioned for the exclusive use of the Jedi Order. This compact, dagger-shaped ship was 8 meters long, designed for use by a single Jedi pilot and a modified astromech droid integrated directly into the fighter. The Delta 7's design drew on elements of the older Aurek-class tactical strike fighter. It was a lightweight, ultra-fast interceptor suitable for a variety of mission profiles. Delta 7 starfighters were highly maneuverable and incredibly fast. Their 2 powerful main engines gave them maximum speeds of 1200 km per hour in atmosphere and a maximum acceleration of 5000 Gs in open space, allowing these nimble craft to easily outrun most enemy fighters. The Starfighter was equipped with powerful communication systems and sensor arrays, and despite the Starfighter's small size, it was both well armored and well shielded, with Delta 7's dagger-like shape facilitating shield coverage. The Interceptor presented a small target profile, making it very difficult to hit. It was armed with a pair of tame and buck dual laser cannons with a forward-firing arc. These were deceptively powerful for their small size and could unleash a withering frontal assault. The Delta 7 only had one primary limitation: it lacked a hyperdrive. However, the Interceptor was compatible with the Transgal Meg Industries Sileor 31 hyperdrive docking ring, and the Delta 7 came equipped with an onboard astromech droid for hyperspace navigation and targeting assistance. These astromech droids were essentially just astromech heads, modified R-series units that had been integrated directly into the Starfighter, as the Delta 7's wings were too thin to fit a proper astromech droid socket. This limited the droid's ability to assist in repairs, but it still allowed the astromech to function as a hyperspace navigator, allowing Delta 7s with hyperspace rings to travel across the galaxy independently. When operated by a skilled Jedi pilot, a Delta 7 light interceptor could take on a whole squadron of droid starfighters in combat, and it was also suited for all manner of other mission profiles, allowing the Jedi to independently pursue missions all across the galaxy without returning to Coruscant or requesting a lift from the Judicials. With the outbreak of the Clone Wars, Jedi generals began using their Delta 7s to lead Republic fighter squadrons into battle, and some Delta 7s were handed out to clone pilots, making these agile interceptors one of the Republic's most effective starfighters in the first months of the Clone Wars. As the Clone Wars went on, many Jedi began modifying their Delta 7s. Numerous Delta 7s were upgraded with more powerful engines or additional weaponry, such as retractable quad-pulse laser cannons and proton torpedo launchers. Some were even equipped with compact hyperdrives. An extreme example of a modified Delta 7 was Anakin Skywalker's fighter, Azure Angel, which boasted larger, souped-up engines, a hyperdrive, adjustable maneuvering fins, a proton torpedo launcher with a magazine of 16 torpedoes, 4 powerful wingtip-mounted laser cannons, and a full-size astromech slot located in front of the cockpit instead of on the port wing. This last modification became standard issue with the debut of the Delta 7B Aethersprite-class light interceptor several months into the Clone Wars. The Delta 7B was an official variant produced by Kuat Systems Engineering that quickly replaced the original Delta 7 as the primary Jedi Starfighter, seeing extensive use from 22 BBY to early 20 BBY. The Delta 7B was identical to the Delta 7 in most respects, except it featured a full astromech socket in front of the cockpit instead of a built-in astromech wired into the port wing. The capabilities of the two variants were the same, but the Delta 7B eliminated the need to modify astromech droids and integrate them into the Starfighter, allowing factory-standard R-Series astromechs to be used as navigators instead. This added flexibility was just more efficient, and as a result, the Delta 7 was phased out of manufacturing in favor of the Delta 7B early in the war, leading to the Delta 7s in service steadily being replaced by the newer variant as the war went on. There was also another, much more rarely seen Delta 7 variant, the Jedi Bomber. This starfighter was more heavily armored, required 2 pilots, and featured munitions launchers on its wingtips. Jedi bombers were rarely seen, and very little is known about their capabilities. The Delta 7 and its cousins were the best starfighters the Republic Starfighter Corps had in the first months of the Clone Wars, but their use was greatly limited by how expensive they were to manufacture. The Republic could afford to hand them out to the Jedi and to a handful of elite clone pilots, but it couldn't produce them in sufficient numbers to make the Delta 7 the RSC's primary interceptor. As a result, the Delta 7 remained a mostly Jedi-exclusive starfighter throughout the Clone Wars. It did see extensive use throughout the war, as it was the main Jedi starfighter until mid-20 BBY, and it continued to be used by some Jedi pilots until the war's end. But only a handful of Delta 7s, if that, were ever involved in any given starfighter battle. For all their utility, the Delta 7 and its variants weren't enough to lead the RSC to victory. The Republic needed new, state-of-the-art starfighters of its own to flesh out the Starfighter Corps' ranks. Originally, it was hoped that Republic CNR systems would fill this void, as CNR's cutting-edge twin-ion engine starfighter had entered the prototype stage on Liana shortly before the start of the war. But between patent issues with the Trade Federation and the damage done to CNR's facilities in the Battle of Liana, the first TIEs ultimately didn't enter service until after the end of the Clone Wars, and in the meantime, the RSC had to turn to other suppliers. It was ultimately Slane and Corpil, the designers of the much-loathed H-60 Tempest, that gave the Republic its first reliable mainline starfighter, the V-19 Torrent. Prototypes of the ship had been deployed in small numbers in the Battle of Geonosis, and their design was promising enough that the Republic placed an order for millions of them shortly after the beginning of the war. However, the process of refining the design, mass-producing it, and training clone pilots to operate the new fighters took several months, and it wasn't until the 4th month of the war that the V-19 Torrent started to be deployed in large numbers. It quickly proved to be highly effective, however, and the RSC quickly adopted the V-19 as its primary general-purpose starfighter. Like many other starfighters produced by Slane and Corpil, the V-19 Torrent had a highly unusual design. For one thing, it was taller than it was long. In flight mode, it was 9 meters tall and 6 meters long. The cockpit was located at the center of a flat, rectangular main fuselage, flanked on both ends by the starfighter's powerful engines. 2 S-foil wings, tipped with laser cannons, were attached to these engines, while a vertical stabilizer with a built-in booster engine was located aft of the cockpit. When the Starfighter was landed, the vertical stabilizer and wings would be locked upwards, while in standard flight mode, the stabilizer would flip down under the main fuselage and the wings would extend outwards, slanted downwards. The Verpine designed the V-19 Torrent so that pilots could manually adjust the orientation of the wings and stabilizer for other configurations as well, which made learning to fly the ship more of a learning curve, but also made the V-19 Torrent more flexible in combat. The V-19 Torrent was a short to medium range snub fighter, though it fared well in space superiority roles too. It was designed to be operated by a single pilot, seated in a cockpit located right in front of the main reactor. The Starfighter appeared to have life support systems for its pilot, but clone pilots nonetheless wore full body flight suits in case they needed to eject. The controls of the V-19 were tricky to master, as they were designed for Verpine hands and compound eyes, but they were still usable by members of most species. Powerful, long-range sensors were built into the tip of the vertical stabilizer, while additional sensors, communication systems, and jamming pods were located in the craft's nose. The V-19 Torrent was propelled by an array of 3 powerful ion engines. The 2 main engines and the stabilizer-mounted booster, which propelled it at speeds similar to those of the Delta 7 Interceptor, though the V-19 Torrent was slightly slower. The V-19 Torrent's S-foils made the ship highly maneuverable as well, allowing it to survive protracted dogfights with agile droid starfighters. Though it lacked shield generators, the V-19 Torrent was well armored, allowing it to participate in attack runs on enemy capital ships and ground positions. The original model V-19 Torrents also lacked hyperdrives and had to use specially modified hyperdrive rings for independent missions, but the Verpine upgraded the design midway through the war, cramming a compact but powerful hyperdrive into the ship's aft section, allowing V-19 Torrents to operate independently at long range. Finally, as with any good snub fighter, the V-19 was also well armed, boasting 2 powerful wingtip mounted laser cannons and 2 concussion missile launchers built into the main fuselage, each with a capacity of 6 concussion missiles. These missiles could inflict serious damage on enemy capital ships and ground emplacements. The introduction of the V-19 Torrent was a godsend for the Republic Starfighter Corps, which finally had a large arsenal of reliable, state-of-the-art snub fighters to follow the Jedi's Delta 7 into battle. Several Acclimator-class assault ships were converted into carriers bearing 156 V-19 Torrents each, while the Navy's new Venator-class Star Destroyers could each carry wings of 192 V-19s. Starting with the Battle of Munilinst, the Republic began deploying large numbers of V-19 Torrent squadrons in battle, and the Republic Starfighter Corps enjoyed an immediate boost in performance as a result. Throughout 22 BBY and into 21 BBY, the V-19 Torrent was by far the most heavily used starfighter in the Republic arsenal, seeing use in major battles at Rendili, Ryloth, and Malastare. Over the course of late 21 BBY, however, the V-19 Torrent began to experience competition from newer starfighter models, which began taking over niches the V-19 had previously filled before replacing it altogether. By 20 BBY, the V-19 Torrent had mostly been replaced by newer starfighter designs. However, squadrons of V-19 Torrents continued to see occasional use through to the end of the Clone Wars, appearing in limited numbers in the Battle of Kashyyyk and the Battle of Coruscant during the Outer Rim sieges. Even while the V-19 Torrent was still the unchallenged favourite of the Republic Starfighter Corps, it couldn't do everything, and the Republic had to find other craft to fill specialised roles. In particular, the Republic needed bombers to replace the reviled H-60 Tempest and the ungainly gunship bomber, and they ultimately contracted Conseil Manufacturing to design them a bomber that didn't suck. Conseil came up with the BTL-B Y-Wing Starfighter, which entered Republic service in late 22 BBY, and functioned as the Republic's main starfighter/bomber until the end of the Clone Wars. Unlike the dedicated heavy bombers the Republic would begin using later in the war, the Y-Wing could function as a heavy starfighter as well as a light bomber, making it versatile as well as powerful. It was on the larger side for a starfighter, clocking in at over 23 meters in length, making it larger than the BTL-A4 and BTL-S3 Y-wings used by the Rebel Alliance. The BTL-B followed the same general design as those later models, however with an arrowhead-shaped main fuselage with two long cylindrical ion engines mounted on the sides of the aft end. The BTL-B had a much sleeker and fleshed out design relative to other Y-wing models, but its capabilities were mostly similar. The Y-wing was operated by a single pilot, a tail gunner, and an astromech. The pilot did most of the work of operating the craft, while the tail gunner focused on defending it against enemy fighters, and the astromech provided spot repairs and navigational assistance. The pilot was seated in a cockpit toward the front of the craft, while the tail gunner was seated in a rear-facing bubble cockpit directly behind them, and the astromech was hooked into a standard droid socket not far aft of the tail guns. The Y-wing's main power generators, hyperdrive, shield generators, and other critical systems were located in the blocky aft end of the main fuselage, while the side-mounted engine pods housed the main thrusters and sensor packages. The Y-wing's two massive Conseil ion engines were incredibly powerful, but due to the large mass of the Y-wing, the craft was still infamously sluggish. Its top atmospheric speed was only 950 km per hour, and in outer space, it was still considerably slower than most other Republic fighters. It wasn't very maneuverable either, a trait the BTL-B shared with most other Y-wings, which, in the words of Luke Skywalker, had a reputation for moving like a sleepy hut. The Y-wing's sluggishness and large size made it fairly easy to hit, but Y-wings could soak up a ton of punishment. The BTL-B was ensconced in thick layers of heavy armor and equipped with powerful deflector shields, which allowed one Y-wing to soak up enough firepower to destroy a whole squadron of V-19 Torrents. Y-wings were among the most durable starfighters to be fielded by either side during the Clone Wars, but their heavy armor did come with a notable drawback. It had to be removed for maintenance, a long and tedious process. This drove Republic technicians to great lengths of frustration, especially since Y-wings needed maintenance constantly. For all their durability, their systems were very temperamental, and maintenance crews could count on having to repair at least one component after every flight. In later years, this frustrating quirk pushed Rebel technicians to strip the armor from the Alliance's Y-wings permanently, sacrificing some durability for easier maintenance and modification. Unlike the Delta 7 and the V-19 Torrent, the Y-wing was equipped with an onboard hyperdrive, albeit a moderate quality Class 2, which allowed Y-wings to independently pursue missions at long range. Y-wing pilots relied on their astromechs for hyperspace navigation instead of a built-in navicomputer, but since the R-series astromechs used by the Republic had the memory for 10 consecutive hyperspace jumps, this wasn't a serious limit on performance. As a starfighter/bomber, the Y-wing came equipped with a variety of weapon systems intended for different roles. The Starfighter's main weapons were a pair of chin-mounted long-range and medium laser cannons, which could pulverize anything smaller than a capital ship that strayed into the Y-wing's forward-firing arc. The Y-wing also featured a set of dual light ion cannons, which were turreted and had a full 360 degrees of rotation. While the main laser cannons were operated by the pilot, the ion cannons were operated by the tail gunner, and they were primarily used to shoot down attacking enemy fighters. These ion cannons were highly effective, and they largely prevented enemy interceptors from taking advantage of the Y-wing's sluggishness. The BTL-B was also armed with an MG7 proton torpedo launcher with capacity for 10 heavy-duty proton torpedoes, as well as a proton bomb launcher with an unknown capacity. These weapons were controlled by the pilot and used for bombing runs against enemy capital ships and ground emplacements, which the Y-wing was very effective at. The BTL-B Y-wing served the Republic primarily as a bomber, carrying out attack runs against hard targets in ground or naval warfare, but it also saw extensive use as a heavy starfighter. While it was ineffective as an interceptor, a Y-wing could hold its own in a dogfight, and Y-wings were sometimes deployed as part of Republic fleet groups' fighter screens. Most of the time though, Y-wings filled purely defensive roles. Venator-class Star Destroyers typically carried 36 BTL-Bs, which was a few squadrons worth. The BTL-B Y-Wing was first deployed at the Battle of the Khalida Nebula, in which the Y-Wing pilots of Shadow's squadron crippled the Separatist dreadnought Malevolence. Following this initial success, the Y-Wing was rapidly adopted by the Starfighter Corps as the Republic's go-to starfighter/bomber, and it saw use in countless battles over the course of the Clone Wars, including at Malastare, Kamino, and Umbara. For many months, the Y-Wing was the Republic's only widely used bomber, but this changed sometime in 20 BBY when the introduction of dedicated heavy bombers carved out part of the Y-Wing's niche. The greater use of these heavy bombers meant that the Y-Wing began to decline in popularity in the later stages of the war, particularly during the Outer Rim sieges, but as it remained the Republic's only starfighter/bomber, it continued to see plenty of use through to the very end of the war. A few months after the introduction of the Y-Wing, the Republic Starfighter Corps began deploying another heavy starfighter, one that would become one of the most well-known Republic fighter craft, the ARC-170. Officially known as the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170 Starfighter, the ARC-170 was a hard-hitting, long-range snub fighter well-suited to a wide variety of mission profiles. It was originally intended for long-range, independent reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory, hence the name, but it quickly evolved beyond this original role as Republic commanders came to appreciate just how effective and versatile the craft was. By mid-21 BBY, ARC-170s were serving as heavy assault fighters, air support, and skirmishers on battlefronts all across the galaxy, and as the war went on, they only got more popular. The ARC-170 was an Incom sub-probe product, one of the last known starfighters designed by the two companies before they ended their partnership. It was designed as a heavier version of the older Z-95 Headhunter, another Incom sub-probe product meant to retain its predecessor's broad utility and well-rounded design while improving survivability and firepower. It had the same basic silhouette as the Z-95, with a long, narrow main fuselage flanked by powerful engines and a set of wings tipped with powerful laser cannons. The ARC-170 was much bulkier than its predecessor though, and its silhouette was made distinct by the integration of two S-foils into each wing, one dorsal and one ventral, which split open to reveal heat sinks during combat. At 14.5 meters long and 22.6 meters wide, the ARC-170 was also a good deal larger than its predecessor, presenting a larger target profile to the enemy, but this was largely offset by the fighter's incredible durability. The ARC-170 required a crew of 3 clone pilots, a pilot, co-pilot, and tail gunner, plus one R-series astromech droid. The pilot was seated in the foremost of the 3 cockpits, located at the end of the ARC-170's long nose, while the co-pilot was seated directly behind them in a separate cockpit, which was seated higher than the forward cockpit to give the co-pilot a clear field of view. The 2 pilots could divide up their duties in whichever way they deemed best, as both pilots were able to assume full control of the craft in a pinch. Typically, the main pilot focused on flying the ARC-170, while the co-pilot served as the forward gunner, operating the fighter's main weapons systems. The third crew member, meanwhile, always served as a tail gunner. This pilot was seated in an aft-facing rear cockpit. The ARC-170's astromech was hooked up into an astromech socket locked between the co-pilot and rear gunner's cockpits, and it handled spot repairs and hyperspace navigation. All 3 of the ARC-170's cockpits were pressurized and featured full life support systems, allowing the pilots to wear open-faced helmets. One of the ARC-170's most distinctive features was its S-foils, which folded flat into niches in the wings in ordinary spaceflight, but splayed open in combat or atmospheric flight. These S-foils allowed the ARC-170 to more efficiently radiate waste heat, preventing its engines or other vital systems from overheating, dispersing the heat generated by air resistance in atmospheric flight, and improving the durability of the ship's deflector shields. They were one of many design features that improved the ARC-170's durability, allowing its pilots to push its engines to their limits and stay in battle longer without needing to fear shield overloads or overheating. In general, The ARC-170 was a very tough craft. The whole fighter was plated in layers of heavy armor, and the ARC-170 was equipped with powerful, highly efficient deflector shields projected from generators mounted on the front ends of the main engines. These shields made the ARC-170 nearly as tough as the Y-Wing. The ARC-170's main power generators lay along the underside of the craft's main fuselage, beneath the aft cockpits and droid socket. They fed power directly to the fighter's two massive engines, which were located on either side of the main fuselage. These almost oversized turbines made the ARC-170 a rather fast ship despite its size and mass, capable of accelerating up to 2,600 G in space and reaching hypersonic speeds in atmosphere. The ARC-170 was a good deal slower and much less maneuverable than the V-19 Torrent and other lighter starfighters, but it could still fly in circles around the Y-Wing, and it was decently maneuverable for its size. It was also hyperspace capable, equipped with an efficient Class 1.5 hyperdrive mounted at the very aft end of the main fuselage. This hyperspace capability was vital in fulfilling the ARC-170's main duty: independent force recon. The ARC-170 was intended to travel deep into enemy space, either alone or as part of a small squadron, to reconnoiter enemy fleets, carry out daring surgical strikes against separatist shipping or other small targets, and then retreat back to friendly lines. The ship was packed full of additional features that improved its ability to carry out such missions. Each cockpit contained air and provisions for up to 5 days, and the craft's nose contained top-of-the-line communication systems that gave the ARC-170 a highly secure lifeline back to its carrier. Also packed into the nose were a gamma-ray imaging spectrophotometer, activity scanners, energy receptors, long-range transceivers, and a headlight, all important sensor systems that were highly useful for recon missions. The ARC-170 also came with sensor jammers that allowed it to evade detection when scouting out enemy positions, to stealthily destroy small craft without the enemy noticing, and to provide a modicum of cover in the event of a hasty retreat. On top of all these features, the ARC-170 was heavily armed. Its main weapons were a pair of wingtip-mounted medium laser cannons, typically operated by the co-pilot, which were incredibly powerful for starfighter-based guns and were capable of extremely precise aim. These guns could destroy even the toughest enemy fighters in just a few shots, and they were powerful enough to inflict serious damage on armored ground targets or light capital ships. 2 turreted light laser cannons were mounted on the craft's tail, meant for defense against enemy craft attacking from the rear. Like the defensive turret of the Y-Wing, these went a long way toward preventing enemy craft from taking advantage of the ARC-170's large target profile and subpar maneuverability to score easy hits. For use against tougher targets, the ARC-170 also boasted hardpoints for concussion missiles and a proton torpedo launcher, the latter of which had a capacity of 6 torpedoes. This allowed the ARC-170 to act as a light bomber, joining Y-Wings on attack runs against separatist warships and ground positions. ARC-170s were usually carried into battle aboard Venator-class Star Destroyers and deployed as part of the first wave of a starfighter wing. Due to the high crew requirements of the craft, the average Venator only carried 36 ARC-170s, but some seem to have carried many more of these formidable heavy starfighters, especially during the later stages of the Clone Wars. When ARC-170s weren't deployed independently for long-range force recon and surgical strikes, they were usually sent out as snub fighters, leading Republic starfighter wings on attack runs against ground targets or enemy capital ships. Typically, ARC-170s focused on attacking hard targets, while squadrons of more agile starfighters protected them from swarms of enemy interceptors. It isn't entirely clear when the RSC adopted the ARC-170. Some sources claim that Incom and Subpro broke up shortly before the start of the Clone Wars in early 22 BBY, but many sources indicate that the ARC-170 didn't see the light of day until about a year later. Some sources state that the design was completed and sold to the Republic shortly before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, but if this was the case, it still took nearly a year for the fighter to make it to the front lines, as its first known deployment was at the Battle of Malastare in early 21 BBY. Once it entered service, however, it quickly became a favorite of clone pilots. Originally, it was mostly used in its intended capacity as a recon craft, but over the course of 21 BBY, it began to be deployed alongside squadrons of V-19 Torrent and Y-Wings in naval engagements, fighting in battles at Camino, Selust, Umbara, and Ringo Vinda, among many others. For the most part, the ARC-170 was used primarily to supplement squadrons of lighter starfighters or accompany bombers on attack runs when deployed in naval combat. During the Outer Rim sieges, however, the ARC-170 began to take on a much more prominent role. It began to be deployed in much greater numbers than ever before, particularly by the Open Circle Armada, and by the end of the war, it was the Republic's second most regularly used starfighter, behind only the V-Wing. Toward the end of the war, the ARC-170 fought in numerous vital battles, most notably above Cato Nemoidia and Coruscant, becoming the most prominent starfighter in the RSC. Due to the success of the ARC-170, Incom and Subpro manufactured two other starfighters for the Republic based on its design during the later stages of the Clone Wars, the PTB-625 planetary bomber and the NTB-630 naval bomber. These were dedicated bombers designed solely to rain vast loads of ordnance upon the enemy, and they were large enough that they pushed the upper limits of what counts as a starfighter. We don't have much detailed information about these giants, but on the whole, they seem to have derived many design elements from the ARC-170. The PTB-625 was a starfighter only in name. It was designed almost exclusively for atmospheric flight, as it was meant for planetary bombardment. Its design bore many similarities to the ARC-170's, with a long central fuselage flanked by two massive sets of engines and a pair of wings tipped with laser cannons. It was, however, not only much bulkier than the ARC-170, but also featured a much larger nose section which sported a smaller set of wings toward the front end. The PTB-625 was propelled by 6 ion turbofan thrusters and could fly at a maximum altitude of 100 kilometers. It was extremely sluggish and lacked maneuverability, but it was well shielded and covered in dense layers of armor plating, so it was tough to shoot down all the same. The PTB-625 required a crew of 5, the exact composition of which was unknown. 2 crew members, possibly the pilot and the co-pilot, were seated in an extra-long cockpit at the aft end of the nose, while a tail gunner was seated in an aft-facing cockpit behind them. The other 2 crew members were likely stationed in the front of the bomber, where there was another bubble-shaped cockpit on the ship's nose. One of these last 2 crew members might have been a forward gunner. The PTB-625 was incredibly well armed, though its poor speed and maneuverability meant it was unable to participate in dogfights. All 4 of its wings were tipped with laser cannons, with the main wings boasting large, medium to heavy guns, and the smaller wings light to medium ones. 2 smaller adjustable light laser cannons were mounted on the tip of the nose, possibly functioning as a forward anti-fighter turret, while the aft gunner controlled twin auto blasters mounted in a turret to defend the bomber against attackers coming from the rear. These guns gave the PTB-625 considerable firepower, allowing the ship's crew to defend it from attacking enemy fighters and strafe larger, more heavily armored enemy ground emplacements. The PTB-625's main feature, however, was a large bomb bay packed with proton bombs, which were meant to be dropped on ground targets. As a dedicated bomber, the PTB-625 carried a large supply of these proton bombs, allowing it to utterly devastate enemy ground forces. During the later stages of the Clone Wars, the PTB-625 supplemented or outright replaced the Y-Wing as a planetary bomber. While the Y-Wing's design balanced its role as a bomber with its capabilities as a heavy starfighter, the PTB-625 had no such limitations, and as such, it had considerably greater firepower and a much larger proton bomb yield. While Y-Wings were still useful for quick, targeted bombing runs, the PTB-625 was much more suitable for large-scale carpet bombing and similar activities. This meant that, during the Outer Rim sieges, the Y-Wing became more uncommon as an air support in ground battles, while the PTB-625 planetary bomber was used heavily to annihilate entrenched Separatist ground positions from above. In the last months of the Clone Wars, flights of the PTB-625s devastated the surfaces of numerous Separatist stronghold worlds, allowing the Republic to slowly conquer the remotest reaches of the Confederacy. The NTB-630 was similar to the PTB-625 in most respects, except it was designed for use against capital ships instead of ground-based targets. We know next to nothing about the NTB-630's exact design, but it was somewhere between the PTB-625 and the ARC-170, retaining the planetary bomber's large, bulkier frame, while also being somewhat smaller, lighter, and much more agile. The NTB-630 was faster and more maneuverable than the PTB-625, allowing it to survive pitched space battles and the point defense guns of capital ships, though it was still poorly suited to dogfighting. It was shielded and more heavily armed than the PTB, allowing the NTB to defend itself against enemy fighters and strafe capital ships. As with the PTB, the NTB's main feature was a large bomb bay carrying numerous proton bombs, which were meant for use against capital ships. A wing of NTBs carried enough proton bombs to completely destroy all but the toughest of the Confederacy's capital ships, allowing these bulky naval bombers to play a major role in space battles. While the PTB largely replaced the Y-Wing as the Republic's bomber of choice for ground battles, the NTB seems to have shared its niche as a naval bomber with the more versatile Y-Wing. The NTB-630 was capable of inflicting much more damage and could be used to outright destroy capital ships, but the Y-Wing was more flexible and could fulfill a variety of objectives in a space battle, making it the better choice in some tactical situations. We don't know how much the NTB-630 was actually used, but like its planetary bomber cousin, it seems to have been deployed primarily during the Outer Rim sieges. The introduction of the ARC-170 completed the Republic Starfighter Corps' arsenal for a time. In the middle months of 21 BBY, the Corps relied on V-19 Torrents as interceptors and strike fighters, Y-Wings as bombers, ARC-170s as heavy assault fighters, and Delta-7Bs as agile Jedi Interceptors. But while this collection of starfighters was highly effective, the Republic's pilots were still seriously outmatched by the Confederacy's swarms of droid starfighters, and the Starfighter Corps kept looking for new fighters that could perform even better than the ones it was currently using. In late 21 BBY, these efforts led to the V-19 Torrent largely being replaced by yet another Incom sub-pro product, the clone Z-95 Starfighter. The Z-95 Headhunter was one of the most popular snub fighter designs in the galaxy in the final decades of Republic history, second only to the Cloak Shape. This versatile starfighter premiered decades to a century before the start of the Clone Wars, and its low price tag and high customizability made it a favorite of sector defense forces and independent operators alike. As we mentioned earlier, the Z-95 Headhunter was one of the most common starfighters in the planetary security forces, and these aging snub fighters were deployed on the Republic's behalf by loyalist PSFs all throughout the Clone Wars. But the original Z-95 Headhunter wasn't suitable for use by the Republic Starfighter Corps, so the craft didn't enter Republic service until Incom and Subpro designed a new, souped-up variant for exclusive military use. The original Z-95 Headhunter model was very similar to what would later become the Incom Corporation's most famous product, the T-65 X-Wing. It lacked S-foil wings and an astromech socket, came with half the firepower, and had a bulkier aft and nose, but in most other respects, the original Z-95 was the spitting image of the X-Wing with a long, needle-shaped central fuselage flanked by 4 sublight engines and 2 laser cannon-tipped wings. It was 11.8 meters long, but despite its small size and compact frame, it was packed full of useful features, making it one of the most well-rounded snub fighters that money could buy. The Z-95 Headhunter was operated by a single pilot who was seated in a cockpit at the base of the craft's nose. The cockpit was pressurized and featured full life support systems with consumables sufficient for 24 hours. The fighter's 4 Incom 2A fission engines were fairly powerful and designed for maneuverability. The stock Z95 had a maximum acceleration of 2,780 Gs in open space and a top atmospheric speed of 1,150 km per hour, and it was highly maneuverable, capable of making sharper turns than all but the most agile of interceptors. The standard Z95 Headhunter lacked a hyperdrive, but it could be retrofitted with one fairly easily, improving the snub fighter's range and versatility. For its size, the Z95 was fairly well armored, and its deflector shields were highly effective, making even unmodified Z95s quite durable. Its main weapons were either two fire-linked tame and back KX-5 laser cannons or triple blaster cannons, in either case mounted on the tips of the fighter's wings. The Z95 Headhunter also featured a pair of underslung concussion missile launchers. This formidable arsenal allowed the Z95 to easily destroy enemy starfighters and carry out assaults against larger targets. By Clone Wars standards, these older model Z95s were mostly obsolete, and though they were used in skirmishes between planetary security forces on some battlefronts, they were hopelessly outmatched against the Confederacy's droid starfighters. However, one of the time-honored strengths of the Z95 Headhunter was its adaptability. The ships were easy to modify and retrofit, and the basic space frame of the Z95 could easily be converted into a much more advanced fighter craft. As a result, Incom and SubPro had a fairly easy time redesigning the Z95 to meet the standards of the modern Republic military, and so the clone Z95 Starfighter was born. The clone Z95 Starfighter, often informally known as the Headhunter in a nod to the original model, shared the basic silhouette and capabilities of the older Z95, but it was much sleeker and had far superior capabilities. The four engines of the original craft were replaced with two larger thrusters based on those of the ARC 170, which were spaced a bit further apart to make room for the craft's side-mounted missile launchers. The nose of the clone Z95 was flatter, sleeker, and longer, and it sported a pair of small wings toward the front end. The clone Z95 clocked in at 16.74 meters long, making it a good bit longer than the original Z95, and the Starfighter had a wingspan of 18.13 meters. As with the original Z95, the clone Z95 was operated by a single pilot. It was moderately armored and equipped with formidable deflector shields, and its engines were incredibly powerful, making the clone Z95 considerably faster than its predecessor. The clone Z95 wasn't only more maneuverable than the original Headhunter, but also more maneuverable than the ARC 170 and V19 Torrent, making it a favorite of clone pilots. The Starfighter's twin wingtip-mounted laser cannons were identical to those of the original Z95 Headhunter, but the clone Z95 replaced the older fighter's concussion missile launchers with a pair of more powerful proton torpedo launchers. The clone Z95 was designed to be essentially a smaller, more compact and more nimble version of the ARC 170, and as much as the ARC 170 had become a favorite of clone pilots, the clone Z95 did as well. The Z95 used most of the same controls as the ARC 170 to allow pilots to be easily cross-trained in the use of both craft, and in combat, the two Incom Sub-Pro products complemented each other well, with the ARC 170 bringing superior firepower and the Z95 bringing superior maneuverability. Venator-class Star Destroyers could carry up to 192 clone Z95s into battle, allowing these nimble craft to be deployed in large numbers for naval engagements. The new Z95 almost entirely outclassed the V19 Torrent, having equivalent weaponry but superior speed and maneuverability, and it quickly filled the V19 Torrent's niche as the Republic's fast attack starfighter, capable of functioning effectively as a snub fighter or an interceptor. Consequently, the clone Z95 starfighter all but replaced the V19 Torrent shortly after its introduction in late 21 BBY, and it went on to see heavy use throughout the second half of the Clone Wars. Its first major outing was in the Battle of Umbara, in which Z95s led the charge against the Separatist fleet over Umbara and provided vital air support for Republic forces on the ground. Over the course of 20 BBY, the Z95 continued to see extensive use, flying in battles over Kadavo, Cadonamoria, and Scipio. But the Z-95's days in the sun were numbered. In the final months of the Clone Wars, it was outclassed by the newer V-Wing Starfighter, and just as it had largely replaced the V-19 Torrent, the clone Z-95 was quickly phased out in 19 BBY. The Z-95 continued to see some use through to the end of the Clone Wars, much like the V-19 Torrent, but only in limited numbers. Before we get on to those late war designs though, we first need to talk about an obscure class of starfighters that saw occasional use from Republic forces: Couriers. Couriers were a class of ship that were basically a cross between a heavy starfighter and a light freighter. They tended to be large enough to carry passengers and cargo, but just barely, and they came with the weaponry, speed, and maneuverability to match a starfighter in combat. Couriers were typically designed to be as fast as possible, with other features being secondary considerations. They had been popular among Republic pilots for millennia, and they were especially favored by the Jedi during the old Sith Wars. The Jedi used Couriers much less by the time of the Clone Wars, but some of these agile ships still saw use in the Republic Starfighter Corps. We don't have many technical details for any of these ships, so we'll go through them all fairly quickly. The smallest Clone Wars era Republic Courier was the Tavia-class armored Picket, a heavily armored scout ship that was intended to defend hyperspace jump points and scour nearby sectors for separatist privateers. Produced by Horsch Kessel Drive Incorporated, a Duros company that was better known for designing capital ships for the Confederacy, the Tavia was on the smaller side for a courier designed for speed, maneuverability, and firepower. It was flown by a single pilot, and it was hyperspace capable, allowing it to be operated independently of a larger fleet group. The Tavia was armed with a variety of laser cannons, including at least one turret, as well as an unslung proton torpedo launcher. Another Horsch Kessel courier used by the Republic Starfighter Corps was the Saltire-class light courier, a larger, tougher, but still very agile ship. The Jedi Order used the Saltire throughout the Clone Wars, while civilian variants were freely available on the open market. The Saltire was larger than the Tavia and could be operated by a single pilot and/or astromech droid. It could carry at least 4 passengers and some cargo, and its cramped but well-equipped interior included a cockpit, an aft crew area, and a galley. The Saltire was hyperdrive equipped and nimble as a starfighter, allowing it to perform similar scout duties to the Tavia, and it was also very heavily armored, equipped with heavy laminate plating that could shrug off a hit from a proton torpedo. Of course, the Saltire was also capable of firing back, and it was armed with several laser cannons. It was primarily designed for long-range scouting missions. Then there was the Row 1 Limitless-class courier, manufactured by Kuat Systems Engineering. This fan-shaped craft was another courier that was frequently used by the Jedi, and unlike the Tavia and Saltire, it was primarily designed as a fast cargo hauler. The Row 1 only required one pilot, but its cockpit also had room for a co-pilot and one passenger. It could carry several tons of cargo and a month's worth of consumables, and it was propelled by 2 L1011 fusel thrust ion engines, which gave the Row 1 considerable speed and maneuverability. The craft sensors were located in a thin spar that ran between the 2 engines, and the Row 1 was also hyperspace capable, as was the standard for couriers. The Row 1 was only lightly armored and shielded, and was armed only with 2 light laser cannons, meaning that it wasn't the best ship for dogfighting. However, it was perfectly capable of holding its own against attackers. The Jedi used the Row 1 as a transport for moving cargo with discretion, and it was a common sight on Republic military supply lines during the Clone Wars. The Row 1, together with the Tavia and Saltire, saw use all throughout the Clone Wars, usually operating in the background as support ships for the Republic fleet. With the couriers out of the way, we only have 2 more Republic starfighters left to talk about, both models that debuted in the later stages of the war. The first was the ETA-2 Actis-class Interceptor, a next-generation space superiority fighter designed by Kuat Systems Engineering. While the Republic generally favored snub fighters over space superiority fighters during the Clone Wars, toward the end of the war, it began dabbling in both categories, paving the way for the Empire's near-total reliance on space superiority fighters in later decades. The ETA-2 was the shape of things to come, and many design elements from the craft would see use in the infamous TIE Fighter. The ETA-2 was designed by Kuat as a replacement for the old Delta-7 interceptors that the Jedi had been using since the beginning of the Clone Wars. The ETA-2 was even more compact than its predecessor, and it was faster, more maneuverable, and had greater firepower, and ditched several non-essential components that Kuat didn't think Jedi pilots would need. After its introduction in mid-20 BBY, the ETA-2 quickly became popular among the Jedi, and though it never completely replaced the Delta-7, most Jedi discarded their old Delta-7s in favor of ETA-2s. Unlike its predecessor, however, the ETA-2 wasn't a Jedi-exclusive craft. The removal of non-essential components from the ship's design allowed it to be mass-produced in great numbers, and it saw use throughout the Republic Starfighter Corps as the Republic's interceptor of choice. At a mere 5.47 meters in length, the ETA-2 Actis-class interceptor was one of the smallest starfighters ever fielded by the Republic. It was highly compact, and its frame was loosely based on the dagger-shaped Delta-7, but with the tail fin and tip removed and its forward hull split into two wings by a broad gap along the centerline. Toward the front of the craft, the two dagger-like wings were fairly flat and lined with weaponry, but they got thicker and broader further aft. On the sides of the aft end, each wing featured a pair of S-foil flaps that opened up to reveal heat sinks in combat or atmospheric flight. When opened, these flaps were nearly perpendicular to the wings, such that, in attack mode, the ETA-2 evoked the shape of the later TIE Fighter from the front. Between the Interceptor's wings, at the aft end of the Starfighter, was the bulbous capsule-shaped cockpit which sat atop the ETA-2's power generators and engine array. The Interceptor cockpit only had room for a single pilot and a small amount of emergency supplies. It was pressurized and had full life support systems, and it had a large canopy that granted the pilot a broad field of view. Due to the fortified design of the ETA-2's forward section, the cockpit featured a front window that gave the pilot a view straight ahead between the two forward prongs of the fighter, improving visibility even further. The ETA-2 also had a socket on the aft end of the port wing that could house an R-series astromech, which provided spot repairs, hyperspace navigation, and targeting assistance. Unlike the original Delta-7, the E2A2 had a full astromech slot despite its small size, eliminating the need for a specially modified, fully integrated astromech unit. The ETA-2 was powered by an onboard reactor located directly behind the cockpit, which fed power directly to the fighter's engines. These were a set of cutting-edge twin-ion engines based on Wraith CNR's design, and they were located directly beneath the cockpit and reactor. These cutting-edge engines, combined with the ETA-2's low mass, made this interceptor blindingly fast, with a maximum acceleration of 5,200 Gs in space and a top atmospheric speed of 1,500 kilometers per hour. The ETA-2's insane speed was matched only by its maneuverability, which far surpassed the Delta-7, as well as virtually every other starfighter on the market. As shouldn't be surprising for a craft of its size, the ETA-2 didn't have an onboard hyperdrive, but it could dock with a Sileor 45 hyperdrive ring, and its onboard astromech could function as a hyperspace navicomputer, allowing the ETA-2 to operate independently of the Republic fleet when need be. To streamline the fighter and eliminate redundancies that it was thought Jedi pilots wouldn't need, the engineers at Kuat designed the ETA-2 with no shields. The interceptor was protected only by a light, if durable, sheath of armor plating, which could shrug off glancing damage but not direct hits, making the ETA-2 a rather brittle craft. ETA-2s that were to be flown by Jedi pilots were further modified to have simplified flight instructions and minimal sensor systems, though interceptors flown by clone pilots had standard equivalents of both systems. However, for all the engineers' efforts to eliminate unnecessary systems, the compactness of the interceptor's design required the addition of S-foils to prevent the weapons or engines from overheating. While S-foils were usually only deployed in combat or atmospheric flight on most starfighters, the pilots of the ETA-2s usually kept the S-foils open all times to reduce strain on engines. When open, the ETA-2's S-foils doubled as a little extra armor plating, catching laser cannon bolts that might otherwise have struck the cockpit. This was a trade-off, however, as the recesses in the hull where the S-foils were docked when not in use were practically unarmored. A lucky shot to one of them could destroy the fighter, and buzz droids could easily drill through the hull there to gain access to the ETA-2's systems. Despite its size, the ETA-2 packed quite a punch, as it was much more heavily armed than the Delta-7. Its main weapons were a pair of laser cannons that ran along the inner ends of the forward prongs. These guns were extremely accurate, long-range, and quite powerful, able to cripple or destroy well-armored enemy fighters in a few volleys. The ETA-2 also boasted 2 small ion cannons on the outer edges of the wings, which had a shorter range but higher rate of fire. These ion cannons could be used to disable rather than destroy enemy fighters, and they were sometimes swapped out for small concussion missile launchers. The ETA-2 was a textbook example of a space superiority fighter. It was lacking in durability, subsystems, and weaponry capable of inflicting damage on capital ships or ground emplacements, but it far surpassed most other craft in terms of speed, maneuverability, and anti-fighter weaponry. It wasn't suitable for attack runs against large enemy targets, but it was excellent for intercepting and destroying enemy starfighters. It had to rely on its maneuverability to avoid destruction, as even a single hit could cripple the starfighter. But in the hands of a Jedi pilot, the ETA-2 was virtually impossible to hit. The best Jedi pilots could destroy entire squadrons of enemy droid fighters from the cockpits of their ETA-2s, and even in the hands of clone pilots, these interceptors were highly effective. ETA-2s piloted by clones tended to rely more on numbers than raw skill in combat, as non-force sensitives struggled to unleash the interceptor's full potential. But a swarm of ETA-2s flown by average pilots was still a force to be reckoned with. As a result, while the ETA-2 was most well known as a Jedi Interceptor, most ships of the class that flew during the Clone Wars were piloted by clones, and Venator-class Star Destroyers typically carried 192 ETA-2 interceptors in total, all or most of which would be piloted by clones. The first prototypes of the ETA-2 were designed and tested in late 21 BBY, including one prototype that Anakin Skywalker used in a dogfight against the Valahari ace, Tophan Vane. The engineers at Kuat tweaked the design based on feedback they had gotten from the Jedi about the Delta-7, and they even designed a number of modified variants of the craft for Jedi pilots looking for more specialized capabilities. When the ETA-2 finally entered service in 20 BBY, it became the new Jedi Starfighter of choice, and Kuat, considering the design a success, began mass-producing the fighter for the use of the RSC as a whole. ETA-2s steadily grew in popularity throughout 20 BBY, and they saw heavy use in the Outer Rim sieges in the last months of the war. ETA-2s fought in battles above Catan Amoria, Boz-Pity, and Belderone, but the most well-known showing was in the Battle of Coruscant, in which a pair of these fighters, piloted by Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, played a critical role. The last starfighter we'll be discussing today was another late war model, the Alpha 3 Nimbus-class V-Wing starfighter. Yet another Kuat Systems engineering product, the V-Wing combined design elements from the ETA-2 Interceptor with a more durable, general-purpose space frame, and it replaced the clone Z-95 starfighter as the Republic Starfighter Corps' primary general-purpose starfighter in the final months of the Clone Wars. Designed by Walex Blissex, who would later go on to design the Rebel Alliance's A-Wing starfighter, the V-Wing was a well-rounded craft that, during the Outer Rim sieges, became the Republic's most used starfighter model. The V-Wing was a highly compact, dagger-shaped craft, and its forward end resembled the older Delta-7 starfighter. Its aft end heavily diverged from the Delta-7's layout, however. Aft of the cockpit, the V-Wing was tall and blocky, with a pair of vertically stacked engines at its very aft end, 2 armored flaps above the aft section, and a pair of dagger-like S-foil wings mounted on circular struts either end of the craft. The V-Wing was fairly small, at only 7.9 meters in length, and its compact design presented a minimal target profile. Like the ETA-2, the V-Wing was operated by a single clone pilot, assisted by an astromech droid. The pilot was seated in a cramped cockpit with no life support systems to speak of, forcing the pilots of V-Wings to wear full helmets and pressurized flight suits, instead of the open-faced helmets commonly worn by clone pilots in the later chapters of the war. They were assisted by a Q7 series astromech droid, a unique astromech variant designed by Industrial Automaton specifically for use in the V-Wing. The Q7 was spherical and floated around on repulsor lifts when not docked into a starfighter. Its dome resembled that of an R2 unit, but the rest of the droid was much more bare bones, like the V-Wing itself. These astromechs hooked into unique astromech sockets just aft of the V-Wing's cockpit, and they assisted with navigation and in-flight maintenance. The V-Wing was powered by an extremely powerful onboard reactor, and it was propelled through space by a set of twin ion engines. These were similar to the ones used for the ETA-2, but the V-Wing was nonetheless slightly slower than its lighter cousin due to its increased mass, with a maximum acceleration of 4,800 Gs and a top atmospheric speed of 1,450 km per hour. The V-Wing made up for its slightly reduced speed with incredible maneuverability, however. In particular, it was capable of making incredibly tight turns. To radiate the extreme heat put off from these high-powered engines, the V-Wing, like many of its contemporaries, featured a set of S-foils for heat diffusion. The V-Wing had 4 small S-foil wings which could fold downwards to function as landing gear when the craft was not in use, but were arrayed vertically like the S-foils of the ETA-2 in combat and atmospheric flight. Like the S-foils of the ETA-2, these wings doubled as added armor plating, and unlike the ETA-2's flaps, they didn't expose vulnerable areas of the ship when open. Apart from these main S-foils, the V-Wing also featured 2 large heatsink panels along the top of the aft section, which were also marginally adjustable. These radiated waste heat from the fighter's deflector shields, allowing the shields to soak up more damage before collapsing, and they also provided added protection for the pilot and the astromech. Those deflector shields were one of the main differences between the V-Wing and the ETA-2. While the ETA-2 sacrificed defensive systems for raw speed, the V-Wing featured heavier armor and deflector shields to ensure better durability, which it balanced with speed and maneuverability. The V-Wing also had full sensor and communication suites packed into its small frame, unlike the ETA-2, though it did lack an onboard hyperdrive. However, the V-Wing was compatible with the Silur 45 hyperdrive rings used by the ETA-2, and its onboard astromech could serve as a navigator, allowing V-Wings to pursue missions independently if need be. V-Wings rarely made use of hyperspace rings, however, as their intended missions rarely took them far from their carriers. The V-Wing was armed with a pair of dual light laser cannons, which had an extremely high rate of fire and could thus quickly chew up most enemy aircraft despite their low yield. A concussion missile launcher could be incorporated into the ship's nose to allow the V-Wing to function as a combat snub fighter as well as a space superiority fighter, though stock V-Wings came without this modification. Though they could carry out snub fight duties in a pinch, Republic captains usually didn't deploy V-Wings that way. They were favored as space superiority fighters. The rise of the V-Wing was another symptom of the Republic's late war switch to relying on space superiority fighters, and it allowed the Republic to strike a nice balance between assault and interception. Squadrons of ARC 170s, Y-Wings, and heavier bombers could still function as snub fighters, carrying out attack runs against enemy capital ships, while the newer ETA-2s and V-Wings functioned as space superiority fighters, protecting the assault wings from interceptors or shooting down enemy snub fighters targeting Republic capital ships. While the ETA-2 was designed as a more aggressive interceptor meant to go out and lay waste to enemy fighter wings, the V-Wing was designed for defense. Typically, V-Wing squadrons provided air defense for loyalist stronghold worlds, served as protective screens for Republic capital ships, or performed escort duties for ARC 170 squadrons in battle or shuttlecraft behind friendly lines. For all of these duties, V-Wings were usually deployed in vast numbers, using the Separatists' infamous swarm tactics against them. Venator-class Star Destroyers carried 192 V-Wings each, and ground-based GAR installations usually had a few attached V-Wing squadrons for air patrols. Star Destroyers would usually deploy their V-Wings first during naval battles, scrambling them to provide a defensive screen to protect their main hangars, while other fighters were sent out in subsequent waves. These screens were difficult for Separatist fighter swarms to break, as V-Wings were more nimble than even the feared droid Tri-Fighter, which excelled against ARC-170s but struggled against V-Wings. The V-Wing began to be produced in limited numbers around the start of the Outer Rim sieges, but after the first ships of the class proved highly effective, Kuat rushed more of these agile interceptors into production. Over the course of 19 BBY, the V-Wings quickly replaced the clone Z-95 Starfighter and many of the remaining V-19 Torrents as the Republic's primary general-purpose starfighter. As V-Wings were easy to manufacture, they were deployed in vast swarms throughout the Outer Rim sieges, becoming a staple of large fleet operations and turning aside many of the Confederacy's counterattacks into Republic space. Behind Loyalist lines, V-Wings almost completely took over air patrol and defense duties, and they fought in several of the last major battles of the Clone Wars. Most prominently, V-Wings fought in the Battle of Coruscant, in which they intercepted Vulture droids carrying out suicide runs against buildings in Galactic City and protected ARC-170s and Star Destroyers alike from Tri-Fighter squadrons in orbit. The V-Wings' performance in the Battle of Coruscant was actually what convinced the leading tacticians of the soon-to-be Empire that snub fighters had become a thing of the past, as while ARC-170 squadrons suffered heavy casualties during the Battle of Coruscant, V-Wing squadrons had fared much better. This led to the development of the Empire's space superiority fighter-centric starfighter doctrine, and like the ETA-2 Interceptor, the V-Wing would go on to serve as inspiration for the Imperial TIE Fighter. So that's our look at the starfighters the Galactic Republic deployed during the Clone Wars. But what do you think? Would you like to see a separatist equivalent of this video sometime in the future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.